But
Yeah.
so I think, the first thing I think of as, when you have an amazing company who helps thousands of athletes. And but the first thing I always wonder is, so how did precision hydration come to be? I mean, where did the idea start? When did the company form? I mean, let's go back to the very beginning, because starting a business, and from what it started as to what it is now and becoming, like, how did it start? Where did it come from?
Yeah, it didn't start out really. The really early days were not the idea of setting up a business. It was a matter of personal curiosity because, like you, I was a triathlete. I was back in the day. I was in the late '90s, early 2000s. I was pretty obsessed with trying to qualify for Kona as an athlete. I'd had a run at doing short course triathlons and was got up to a reasonable level, like a national, international level, but wasn't going to make it to the Olympics or anything like that. I was on the fringes of the national squad, and so I did the natural thing and leapt up to longer distances and some Xterra. I basically suffered massive problems in the heat because I have a high sweat rate, and as it turned out, the end of the story is I kind of had a really heavy sodium loss in my sweat as well, but I didn't know that at the time at first. And so I went to numerous races, including out to Kona, had really terrible performances in the heat and got very frustrated. And it was a doctor friend of mine, Dr. Raj Jutli, who suggested that I have a sweat test. And at the time, I didn't understand what that was, but it was a test to measure the sodium loss and the salt loss in my sweat. And he said to me, I think your score's going to be off the charts. I think that's where your problems are coming from. And so I went along with it. Sure enough, he was dead right. My sweat sodium level is really, really high. And for anyone who figures in this area means something to them, I lose nearly 2 grams, or I lose 1,800 milligrams of sodium for every liter of sweat, which is like two and a bit times the average. And once he then, it took a little bit of trial and error, but once he'd corrected that with me with a plan for how much salt I should be taking in races, it was like night and day. It was just such a difference. I never would have said after that, and even to this day, I'm not someone who loves racing in extreme heat. I would prefer to race in cooler climates, but I feel like I can do myself justice in the heat, which I never could before. And so that was the genesis of the idea. And then it was a very convoluted story of, taking that idea and turning it into a business, because I was already working in sports science. I have a sports science degree. I was working coaching some athletes, and I basically thought, wouldn't this sweat test be cool as a service to bring to other athletes?
Yeah. And what year was that? Do you remember when you started it?
So the company was founded in 2011, but this journey for me, so my own journey with it and sweat testing started in the early 2000s. So I was probably got sweat tested. It would be around 2005, maybe something like that.
Wow.
Um, and that was, it took a bit of time to work up the idea, because at first, like any athlete, I kind of solved the problem for myself and didn't really think beyond that. At
Yeah.
the time, I was very focused on my own racing, and it was only when I started working with other athletes I thought, well, this is maybe a cool test that no one else is doing, and this could be really useful for other people.
Yeah, so I'm curious, I mean, you've been in the sport for a long time, and for people who have been in the sport for a long time, you see a lot of ideas come and go. Sometimes you see ideas come and go many times, and then you also see different nutritional ideas and different nutrition companies that come and go. But you guys have you guys haven't left, and you continue to grow. And I'm curious to know, like, in your own thoughts, I mean, what has been like the difference maker that has helped you all just continue to grow, continue to stay forward? I mean, like, I'm curious to know your thoughts on how the wheels keep moving.
I think there's a couple of different things that are responsible for that, really. One, if you look at it purely from a physiology point of view, and also at the same time, like through the sports nutrition marketing lens, we've always founded what we do on the basis of evidence and on the basis of, what genuinely works with athletes in the field. And and so human physiology hasn't evolved in the last 20 years. It hasn't evolved in the last 200 years.
Mm.
We're the same, and we will be the same going forward for the foreseeable future. So the demands of what your body needs when you're exercising are relatively set. We've focused on, initially at least, on sweat and sodium loss being a key metric, and then trying to find ways to replace that as accurately as possible for people, because certainly in the heat and in longer races where sweat losses are high, that's a critical component of performance, particularly if you're like me and you lose a lot of salt. It can be a total game changer. So I think the reason the idea has endured is because it's helped so many people. We have some amazing testimonial stories going back 10 years now with people that you found our products, and like me, it's kind of changed their racing life, and they've continued to be really loyal customers. And then I think the reason that we've endured in the business sense is that what we haven't tried to do is like jump on bandwagons. Like you see, there's always a latest and greatest like additive in a nutrient or a something or another, or a feature. One that is very current and very topical is everyone's going a little bit crazy for hydrogel technology and hydrogels in nutrition. And there might be a little bit of science behind why that might offer a small advantage, but we would take the view, for example, in carbohydrate needs for athletes, that it doesn't matter whether it's a hydrogel or what it is. You need the fundamental principle is like how much you're taking per hour. That's the killer question for athletes. And maybe the hydrogel, once you're taking the right amount, maybe the hydrogel might offer a small incremental, very like small incremental advantage on the top if it does, speed up absorption or whatever, or delay gastric emptying. But it's actually, when you boil it down, the physiology of an athlete is an endurance athlete is you sweat and you expend fluid and salt and you burn calories, mainly carbohydrates. If you get roughly the right amount of water, the right amount of salt, and the right amount of carbs back in while you're racing, you will, all other things being equal, have a great day. And that's what we focus on. So I'd like to think that we're kind of growing and enduring because what we're selling, if you like, in terms of information, tools, products, or whatever, is just legitimately helpful to athletes. And I think our retention of customers shows that. Like, we're pretty small in the sports nutrition is dominated by some relatively big brands, and we're a relatively small player. We've grown organically over 10 years, and we have a staff of, as we're speaking, 15 people, and kind of a nice medium-sized enterprise growing business, but we're not big by any means. But hopefully the more people that come on board with us, our customers are very loyal, because I think we deliver on our promises, and that's the aim.
Yeah, yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. Is that, one, I think how you use everything you have to offer is very practical. Like, it's very simple and it's very practical. And I'm sure too, when you see something new come up, it's like, okay, but then you see like the whole industry go that direction. Everything is like, that's it, that's it. But then it goes back to the basics, right? Like you said, and the basics are exactly what you just said. Um, but then I think I forgot where I was going with that. But I mean, you hit a lot of great points there with that. So changing gears toward, I want to talk about training and racing. And you talked about hot climates. Triathlon, for the most part, everybody races in the heat. It's not necessarily like Kona, but I mean, when you are on the bike, when you're running, I mean, it's hot, right? It's like you're not going to find a cold race. And if you find a cold race, you're probably not going to find many people doing that cold race. I mean, most people are going to be racing in that. So I think the one thing is, you mentioned that you did a sweat test, and I've done sweat tests in the past. I've done one of your sweat tests, and you said that you were almost at 2 grams an hour, right? So almost 2,000
Yeah.
milligrams, right? Per liter, right? Is it per
Yeah.
liter?
Yeah, for me, with a sweat rate of 2 liters an hour at peak,
Yeah,
2.5 liters, that can be like nearly 4 grams, or certainly 3.5 grams of sodium. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so when I did yours, I think mine was around 920 milligrams per liter. So I'm half of yours
Yeah.
essentially, right? And I think the thing is that if you and you have calculators on your website that help direct people to find close, like it's a close estimate. Like, there's no way you're going to find exactly online, but you help people get them set by using theirs. And when I went through your calculator, what you guys recommended off of, I think, the 20 questions that you put people through, it was almost exactly to where I was at, and the preloading, the tablets that you recommended, the gels, everything was really good. So, like, let's take people from the very beginning of, if you go through that calculator and say, okay, well, let's say this person per liter is sweating 100 milligrams per hour. We start with that. And so for you, like, how would you recommend somebody start with like a baseline of saying, yep, okay, this person we found they sweat 1,000 milligrams per liter. Um, like what would you recommend that they like start training with through that process?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's quite a complex one to give and it's probably a difficult one to give a short answer to because it encompasses a load of different factors. But that's
Mhm.
what our questions try to grab. But probably the best place to start with explaining that is that you can come at it from two ends. You can come at it from what does the evidence say? What does the scientific evidence and the practical experience of working with athletes tell us that are roughly decent ballpark figures for people to be replacing in terms of fluid and sodium. And so there are some like buckets that we can put you into if you're a low volume sweater, a medium volume sweater, a high volume sweater, or whatever, as to what's a reasonable level of fluid replacement. And then same with the sodium loss. If you're a low sodium loser or a moderate or a high, there's kind of plausible levels that tend to work for people like that. And then from the other coming at it from the other end, you've got kind of the lens of past experience, and it's like, what have you been doing to this point? Because a lot of athletes may have not been doing it perfectly, but they're probably not getting it completely wrong because we all test and adjust things all the time in the field. So where we can, we like to gather a bit of general information to see what ballpark we'd put someone in. Then we look at past history and like what's worked or what hasn't worked, and then you mesh the two together and come out with and then essentially what you're doing is saying, well, Steve, if you used to be drinking like a liter or 750 mils an hour with about 200 milligrams of sodium, do we feel from the evidence base that's presented that those numbers need nudging up or down, or is the fluid about right but you need more sodium, or is this fluid a bit high and you need a bit less? Or so we try to make essentially it's a bit like detective work. You kind of zone it, and then it's an iterative process of getting the numbers dialed in. And the good thing is the level of interrogation you need to get to is not too precise. The precision in our name is around the idea of getting in the right zone rather than hitting the exact target on a bullseye. It's like
Mhm.
I was getting it horribly wrong in my racing because I sweated a lot. So I was drinking vast amounts of fluid and very little sodium.
Mm.
The two things that Dr. Jutley encouraged me to do, one was obvious, was increase the sodium, but the other one was actually maybe reduce the fluid a little bit because I was really maxing out on what was tolerable on fluid and possibly didn't need it and was putting my GI system under too much distress. So that was a sensible readjustment. And the reason I was having such problems is my numbers were like totally incongruent with what I needed.
Yeah.
So, and we find, like, for example, with someone like yourself, if you're coming out at 920 milligrams in the middle of the bell curve for sweat sodium loss, right in the middle of average,
Mhm.
then actually it's probably you've probably got a little more leeway and a little bit more flexibility, because where I could get into a sodium deficit in 2 or 3 hours, it might take you more like 4 or 5 or 6 hours before you start to get into the same kind of hole. So your bucket, if you like, that you're aiming for is perhaps a little bit wider, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that made me think of two things. So, and they're both a little separate, but one, you hear people talk about, well, you find out how much sweat you need, like say before a workout, step on a scale, after the workout, step on a scale and see how much you've lost. Well, that only solves such a small portion of that. And that could put people in a lot of trouble saying, well, within a 2 hour workout, I lost, 4.5 pounds, which means I need to replenish this. But it's not even addressing like the whole sodium side of things. And like you were saying, if you just drink a ton of liquid, but you're not addressing the sodium side of things, like you can get yourself in quite a bit of discomfort. But the one thing I'm wondering is, so initially when people come and you talk to people, do you find that most people uh, take in too little sodium, the right amount of sodium, or do you find that most people take in too much sodium? What do you all find initially?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I would, and it's not one I can give you a straight up like everyone tends to do this answer. I would say that you find all three of those. I think
Mhm.
you find we've definitely seen with people who've had problems with exercise in the heat, with cramping, with stuff that you could feasibly attribute to inadequate sodium supplementation, they will sometimes overreact and tend to address that by taking too much. Often, actually, not by taking too much sodium outright, but by taking too much fluid, because a lot of the problems that people associated get attributed to dehydration rather than sodium depletion. So then what you find is an overcorrection in terms of how much fluid you drink. This was certainly the case for me, by the way. And then that almost compounds the issue, because you end up diluting sodium losses further. So there's kind of a camp that overreact and do too much. But then I do think there is a camp of people that just use electrolyte products. So a standard electrolyte drink on the market at the moment has between 400 and 500 milligrams of sodium per liter, which is like a reasonable amount of replenishment for soccer players, or people who are doing relatively short activities. Even for people like myself who lose a lot of salt, if we're doing an activity for 90 minutes or 2 hours, we're unlikely to be able to run up a serious sodium deficit. So most sports drinks cater for short distance stuff fine. When you get into the long course stuff, if people are using weaker sports products, certainly if they're heavier sweaters or lose more sodium, they're the group that under replace quite. And a lot of people just don't have this concept of what appropriate dosing of electrolytes is. So I used to think of them, I've said this before to people, like a little bit like it's pixie dust. Like you just need a little bit. It's like a magical element. As long as you take some, you'll be fine. And so I used to take some electrolytes in and think, well, that does the job. But I had no concept of the fact that I was probably taking 20% of what I actually needed. And so it's getting your head around what those dosage figures are. And that's what a lot of our education is about. Is like, if you're like me, 1,000, even 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour on the bike in a hot Ironman is not outrageous. But you tell that to a standard doctor, or just like put it in the context of a normal day-to-day life, that's an outrageous amount of sodium to be taken in. But at the same time, I'm losing an outrageous amount of sodium while I'm doing that activity. And I think a lot of endurance athletes who do a lot of sweating, a lot of training, are probably as at risk from undersalting as they are from oversalting.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about heat acclimation. And when people hear this all the time, right? When you go to a hot race, you need to do acclimation. You need to be acclimated for the heat. But like at the core of it, what is the goal of it? Like, what is the goal that people should be trying to achieve, or what is the goal internally that happens with heat acclimation?
So heat acclimation, the human body is actually really physiologically phenomenal when it comes to learning to exercise in the heat. We're better than pretty much any other mammal on the planet when it comes to endurance exercise in the heat. And that's to do with evolutionary history, the fact that we evolved in Africa in the hot, dry savannah. We had to hunt and move in the heat of the sun in the day. So you take a dog out running in the winter and the dog will kick your ass over 10 miles. You take a dog out running in the summer and in 90 degrees, and the dog will stop under a tree and lie down because it just has had enough. And we can sweat a lot and we can cool down, and that makes us good. But when we go and expose ourselves to the heat, especially if you've been living in a cold climate, or where you live, it's obviously like really quite cold in the winter, but then gets really quite hot in the summer, and you'll go through a period of acclimation. And that is, so acclimation is driven by repeated exposure to a heat stress, and you can augment it by exercising in the heat. So when you do, say, like 5 days of back-to-back exercise in the heat, you will see things like, if you could measure it, your blood plasma volume will increase. That's a huge factor that improves your ability to pump blood around to the skin and to the muscles, and it allows you more of a reservoir to sweat. Your core body internal temperature will reset itself to be a little bit lower, so you've got more of a headroom to stop your core temperature boiling over. You see other things like your sweat rate will go up, because that enables you to cool more effectively. And there's loads of other little adaptations that happen. You'll also your heart rate will get lower. You will, and really importantly, a sum of all of these things is you just like feel more acclimated. So if you ever have been from a cold climate on vacation or somewhere, and you land in a really hot, humid place, day one, you think, shit, I'm never going to be able to like even run 5K in this. By day 7, you're trotting out a half marathon, no worries. And it's just because your body makes all these positive adaptations that the main goal they have in mind is managing your core temperature not to boil over
Yeah.
in heat.
And so I'm curious to like how like so you said about 5 days, but like when people go through and I'm sure you've discussed heat protocols with people, how long do you recommend? Like let's say you are going to like your A race is going to be hot, or like let's say it's going to be St. George or Kona or anything. I mean, like should you be doing it 3 weeks out, right? I mean, do you do it a week out? I mean, like what is like how long does it take for those changes to happen? And again, I'm sure it's different for a lot of people, but like what is like that recommended amount that you want to really expose yourself to some heat or humidity that's close to what you'll be experiencing on race day?
So the science will say pretty categorically that sort of 14 days is the optimum window for maximal heat adaptation. So if you go to a hot climate for 14 days, train lightly each day, you will be pretty well as adapted as you're ever going to be after that period. So that's a kind of simplistic view of it, and what it highlights is that you can get heat adapted pretty quick, you know. And what's even more interesting is if you're pressed for time, you can get about 70 or 80% of those adaptations in 5 or 6 days. So there's a very strong effect in the first few days, which then tapers off down to about 14 days. Um, what you have to factor in, which some athletes don't, is that during that time, the quality of training you can undergo will be dramatically compromised. You know, certainly if you're moving to a hot place, it's different if you're doing like acclimation sessions in a heat chamber but living in a cold environment, because that's kind of a happy medium. Because although you're not living in the heat and developing more benefits from that, what you are able to do is do your high intensity training sessions out of the heat to get maximum gains, whereas you do your lower intensity training in the heat to sort of stimulate those heat adaptations. But the reason why you'll see, if like money and time is no object, this is why you'll see the pro athletes go for a month before, because that enables them to spend the first 10 days like acclimating with a slightly lower training load, then ramping their training back up before they taper for the race. And I think the other thing is as well, although this magic 14 days is definitely a physiologically proven phenomenon that most of your adaptations happen, I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that if you move to a hot climate, you'll be better at coping with it after a year than you would be after 14 days, because that long-term repeated exposure allows you to make lots of little behavioral modifications, and there's probably more subtle stuff going on in the body. And I would imagine then you go even further and say, how do you cope with it, you know, after 10 years of living somewhere hot? There's even more benefit. So
Yeah.
the great news is, though, basically, to cut, you know, to the soundbite there really, I suppose, is that you can get most of the adaptations to the heat in 5 or 6 days, and if you can do 2 weeks, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So it's achievable for a lot of people.
Cool. And so let's talk a little bit about sodium during like heat acclimation. So like let's say, okay, we know this person, they're sweating 900 milligrams per liter, not necessarily per hour, but per liter, and they go through the 14 days. So does that person with those changes lose less sodium per liter, or does the sodium stay the same per liter, but you sweat more liquid to help cool your body? Like what? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, so again, the scientific evidence points strongly to the fact that you'll sweat more volume,
Mhm,
and that if anything, the sodium content of that sweat will decrease a little bit.
mhm,
A lot of the papers that are written are on people who are perhaps less well trained than endurance athletes. So they tend to show anything up to a 20-25%. I think I've even read 30% decrease in sweat sodium losses when you go from unacclimated to acclimated.
well,
What I would say, based on all the data we've got, and we've got lots of data on athletes on training camps who've done sweat tests and before and after, and I've done a lot of testing myself when I've been out in a hot climate for a month and repeatedly sweat tested. With trained endurance athletes, we typically see less of a shift downwards in their sweat sodium. And the theory is that that's because elite endurance athletes who train regularly are already partially heat acclimated all the time. So even in Wisconsin in the winter, if you're training a bit indoors, you're going out and running with layers on and getting a sweat on, you are stimulating all of the similar adaptations that drive heat adaptation, even though the environment is cold, because you're pushing your core body temperature up. So my working hypothesis with athletes most of the time, if we can't repeatedly sweat test them because it's either too costly or impractical, is that we don't worry too much about factoring in a huge amount of sweat sodium drop, because apart from anything else, the increased sweat volume means that net sodium loss tends to go up anyway, and the drop in sweat sodium might be there, but it's probably not going to be really dramatic.
Yeah. So this happens a lot during Ironman Wisconsin in September, is that we're training, June, July, August, and it's the peak months for us in terms of heat, right? Humidity, heat, incredibly hot. But then the week before the event, 2 weeks before, the temperature starts to drop, and it drops and it drops. So a lot of our long rides or long runs are done in very hot climate. But then on race day, you might see 15 to 20, 25 degrees swing in temperature, where all of a sudden, what we've prepared all summer for nutritionally, hydration wise, on race day, it is nowhere near that. So how would you adjust a plan if you're used to riding in 85 degrees, 90 degrees, but then all of a sudden on race day it's a high of 70, let's just say 20 degrees? I mean, does the sodium demand change? How would you hypothetically adjust those variables with a temperature swing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We have the same phenomenon in the UK with the London Marathon in
Mm.
reverse, because the London Marathon's in April usually, and then people train all through the winter, and then it can go from being virtually 0 degrees, Celsius, up to 22 degrees, which is probably what, in the low 80s or something, or high 70s at least. And that we can have this like swing the other way where nobody's heat adapted, and all of a sudden the race day is a lot hotter. And I think the reality is there's only, you can prepare so much, but a lot of it comes down to experience. And basically, if it's hotter, and probably the easier one to cope with in general is you've been training through the heat, and then it gets cooler. That generally means that you're well adapted. Heat stress and heat adaptations kind of help you in the cold as well, to an extent, because you're able to push more watts and you've got more blood volume and that sort of thing. So you would probably just find that the fluid volumes and concurrently the sodium, total amount of sodium you need to take, decreases. And we would often encourage athletes, especially those with a bit more experience, to kind of dial that down with instinct. So it's like, basically, on the bike, you might have been drinking, let's say you were drinking 2 bottles an hour, around, two 16-ounce bottles an hour, 32 ounces an hour. You might cut that back to 1.5 in general at the early start part of the ride, and then even decrease it further if it feels like you're peeing a bit, or you're getting bloated, or you know or if the temperature swing goes the other way, you might dial it up a little bit. But you kind of need to know what your, we call it guardrails, but what your upper and lower limits are, and then you play around within that. And there's no, unfortunately, to a degree, there's no substitute for hard-won experience there. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's pointless having a plan by any stretch. I believe you should go into these longer and hotter endurance events with a very solid nutrition and hydration plan. But it's kind of like going into like the famous wartime quotes about, no plan makes contact with the enemy. You kind of, the process of planning is really useful and insightful, but you have to kind of feel it out a little bit on the day. And in a long triathlon, we always say to people, start following the plan, and then the deeper into it, the more you adjust and the more you go on feel. There's no point in repeatedly banging in 2 bottles an hour on the bike if you're feeling bloated and weeing all the time, just because that worked for you in the summer. You kind of have to have the presence of mind to adjust it. And that's one of the biggest skills. It's a bit like pace judgment. It's something which you can theorize about all day, but until you've gone and ran a marathon and gone out 10% too hard, you kind of don't learn the lesson. So
Yeah.
yeah, if that makes sense.
Yep. And so talking a little bit on like, when you're looking at, the again, like this is like something that we're reading about, are, more carbohydrate during races, right? what was, you know, the initial 240 was now 300, and now you hear 400 per hour, right? And then, my goodness, you know, you see people take above that.
Yeah.
But for people who do start to experiment with more carbohydrate, you know, with more carbohydrate, do you need more liquid to help push that through? I mean, have you seen that where, like, mistakes people make when they say, "Yep, we're going to take on more carbohydrate"? I mean, do you need more liquid that comes with that, which then takes more sodium to come with that, and just the balancing act with the whole more carbohydrate trend? What needs to follow with that?
Yeah. This is again a really good question, because those three factors, sodium, fluid, and carbs, all kind of work together to increase absorption through the GI tract into the bloodstream, and getting that balance right is essentially the reason for precision fuel and hydration existing, because that's going back to that recipe that I talked about of, like, yeah, water, salt, carbs. You need to get them about right. Now, do I think you need more fluids if you're taking more carbs? I would say that is a very much so. It depends on the weather conditions, because I think if you overload the gut with too much carbohydrate in the heat and insufficient fluid, you accelerate GI distress for sure. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, just pouring more liquid in, or even more sodium in liquid is the solution. You know, it's kind of, there's a balancing act. And I think one of the biggest factors that people underestimate is that I'm a fairly big believer in the fact that I'm not completely anti the idea of some, for instance, a little bit of fasted training, a little bit of fat adaptation to an extent, but it as a way to augment certain niche types of training. But as a principle, my guiding principle is, like, large amounts of carbohydrate, if you can tolerate them, tend to be linked with faster performances. You know, that's just what we see, and it's what the evidence points to. So one of the biggest mistakes I see athletes making is setting unrealistic carbohydrate targets in races based on the fact they haven't trained with those levels of intake. So, you know, if I can pretty much, you know, tolerate, and I don't race as seriously, anywhere near as seriously as I used to, but I know that I'm in the middle ground there. I'm not like a guy who can't tolerate a lot, but I'm not up at 100 grams an hour or something like that. I'm probably like 70, 80, 90 grams an hour is pushing it for me. But in the little bit of personal experimentation I've done, you can tweak that up. And that's certainly what we see with some of the athletes in the last 6 weeks before a race. If you do all your big brick sessions with an increasing carbohydrate dose, you kind of figure out where your ceiling is and how much fluid you need with it, and you can then feel it out. But that's a question where, you know, to kind of borrow your question about sodium and fluid and put it into this context, what do we see athletes mostly doing, under or overdoing it? I'd say the vast majority are underdoing the carbohydrates, but there's a cohort that are overdoing it on race day, because it's more they're underdoing it in training, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
So two more questions in this category. Is one, or they're both the same? So what are symptoms that an athlete might feel if they are not taking in enough sodium? And then what are symptoms that athletes might feel if they're taking in too much sodium?
Yeah. Taking in way too much sodium in the short term can often make you feel quite thirsty and quite sick, because sodium levels rising in the blood are a key driver of the thirst mechanism. So it's like if you eat a load of salty peanuts and don't have a drink, you will be burning for a glass of water, and you get that very, very strong sense of thirst. If you can also, if you take it in, for instance, in capsule form or pill form, and you kind of put sodium bombs in the stomach, and without insufficient fluid, it can literally make you sick or give you diarrhea, because the body will just try to get that excess out. So that's in the extremes. In chronically, if you take too much sodium, like back-to-back training days and that sort of thing, like chronically over salt, you might see fluid retention if your kidneys aren't flushing it out very well. So you get a bit puffy and a bit overweight from fluid. It's the exact opposite of the reason why bodybuilders and those sort of people and fighters who are cutting weight and wanting to be more lean and ripped will reduce sodium, because it flushes body water out. Well, if you take too much sodium, you retain body water to dilute it down. So that would be a more chronic sign. Signs that you're not taking enough sodium can be a little bit harder to detect, but Cramping is a controversial one. Not everyone would agree with it, but often we see cramping linked with inadequate sodium intake or excess fluid with not enough sodium. You can feel like lethargic and a bit like you're bonking, a bit like it's a bit like a loss of power and lethargy, but not the same as, not that's going to be corrected by sugar. And you don't start craving sugar. You might even start to crave salt. And often you don't realize, I certainly didn't early on when I was experimenting with sodium intake, you didn't realize how you were feeling until afterwards when you took some salt capsules or whatever, and then a few minutes later started to feel way better, that okay, it was like sodium was the issue. So it can be, you can also get things like bloating in the stomach, where then you take a couple of salt capsules, the bringing the sodium back into the mix balances things out and allows your body to digest it a bit better, and it clears your stomach. So people, I think, loss of power, lethargy, potentially a craving for salt, things that you can't associate with out and out low blood sugar could be associated with low sodium levels.
Yeah. And so the last thing is sodium preloading before very, hot training sessions, hot races. And, I see on the website that you all recommend this. So I'm curious to know if you can talk a little bit more on how to go about determining how much to take. How do you take that? How long before the event or the big training session should you do the preload?
Yeah, that's a really common question. We've got a solid blog on that on the website as well, which will be worth me sharing with you for people who want to read a bit more into it, and I think a little video that goes with it as well. But basically, the concept of preloading is that everyone knows intuitively that you want to turn up to a big training session in the heat or a big race well hydrated. But the default reaction to that often is the wrong one, which is just to drink tons of water in the build-up. And what you actually do then is you flush out, your kidneys work overtime, you pee a lot and your pee's really clear, and you go to the bathroom and you think, oh, I'm really well hydrated because I'm peeing out clear water the whole time. But actually what you're doing is just flushing electrolytes out of your body, and you can end up on the back foot. So the way to get around that is to drink normally in the days leading up. But if it's a big session or race, the night before and the morning of, we recommend taking a very strong electrolyte drink, normally about 16 ounces of Precision Hydration 1500, and then the same again on the morning about an hour before you start, because that tops up your tanks. It gives you the sodium, pulls a lot of the fluid from the gut into the bloodstream and holds it there, so you don't dilute the sodium levels, which can lead to hyponatremia. You expand your blood volume, and you also manage to you start better hydrated than you otherwise would without taking on a massive fluid overload. Because unlike glycogen loading, carbohydrate loading for increased energy, you can't load up with loads and loads of extra water. Your kidneys just chuck it out the body. You're not a camel. You can only preload a very small amount. And as I say, if people want to understand the exact protocol and the science, the blog's worth a read. But certainly what you can't do is start pre-water loading like 3 or 4 days out. That has no bearing on what happens on the event at all.
Yeah. And I think, and again, personally, when I first started doing this, is again using the tablets, the 1500, is that I think the reason why I like your guys's form of sodium and like the lower, just basically lower calorie, but there's basically no calories in these tablets. So I think that, when you're going through training, you're going through a sodium preload, there's almost zero flavor, almost zero calories, to where it's not really going to be something that's going to upset your stomach by taking in even more carbohydrate than you will on the race day or for breakfast. That'll kind of pump up potential GI issues. So, but yeah. Okay, so turning focuses toward, again, so you guys do have a really great website with a really great blog that has like a ton of awesome education in there. So whoever is listening to it, I would highly recommend just going to the website, going to the blog, and reading about this. But I think the one thing in terms of fueling, it is the hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. And I think this gets a lot of discussion among the endurance community with how do you fuel for like these races. And I think there's people that don't even understand that that there are certain ways to going about that. So can you just quickly just discuss the differences between the three types that you have listed?
Yeah, I mean, the tonicity of drinks really is a description in very simple terms of the amount of mass, the amount of stuff that is dissolved into the liquid, and they're related, and how that relates to the amount of stuff that's dissolved in your blood, because the way fluids move across the gut wall involves osmosis. And if you remember back to school and biology lessons, and the way that fluid moves across a membrane from areas of lower concentration to higher concentration, if the difference, so an isotonic drink, which is one a lot of people have heard of, is one where the tonicity, the amount of mass in it, is very similar to the blood. And isotonic drinks were the kind of the first sports drinks, so like the Gatorades and the Powerades and those kind of things, because they were designed to provide a balancing act of some calories. They're fairly high in sugars and carbohydrates. You usually get about 30 grams of carbohydrate per 16-ounce serving, something like that. It's about a 6% carbohydrate solution, and some electrolytes and some fluids. So the idea was an isotonic fluid is like a real jack of all trades. It gives you some fluids, it gives you some carbs, it gives you some electrolytes. So they can be really good when you're doing something short and fast, like a sprint or Olympic distance triathlon, and you just need some calories, you need some fluids, but the exact ratios are not too critical. You just need to get some in and hydrate and fuel. Where you run into a problem with those is if you start, and I did this I did Kona in like 2004, and I was just drinking Gatorade on the course and just getting a sick stomach after a while, because I needed to drink so much because it was hot and I was sweating so much that by doing it, I was probably taking on like, I don't know, 150 grams of carbs an hour or something ridiculous like that, and just feeling totally bloated and sick. And that's where in longer and hotter races, the best drink by far to use is one that's hypotonic. So HYPO, hypo being lower, so it's thinner than your blood. And all of the drinks that we make at the moment are all hypotonic. So the ones you mentioned, the tablets, are very low tonicity because they only have electrolytes in. We make a very light carbohydrate and electrolyte blend, which has about 15 grams of carbs per 16-ounce serving. And now we also make a double strength one, which is a 30 grams of carb serving as well. But we lab test all of those, and all of them are lower tonicity than blood. So they're hypotonic. And that makes them generally better choices for longer events in the heat, because they are absorbed into the bloodstream way quicker, resulting in less GI distress. And so they're like hypotonic for hydration, isotonic for sort of short stuff, and then going above that, hypertonic is more mass than your blood. So it's a thick solution, and the classic one that athletes use where they realize it's a hypertonic drink or not is flat cola. So flat Coca-Cola is about 10 or 11% carbohydrate. It's more energy than fluid. And so late on in the race, as well as it having a bit of caffeine, people are reaching that really for the sugar rather than for the liquid. And so hypertonic fluids are really good at delivering energy fast. But like with isotonic drinks, you've got to be careful. You can't really hydrate with these things. They're for energy, rather than purely for liquids. And I think just understanding those differences is really important.
Yeah, I mean, on a coaching front, I mean, the last thing you said is the biggest thing is that you see people that say, okay, well, they say they get like a Gatorade in a tin, right? A tin. It doesn't come in tin anymore, but you know what I mean, like a container. They say, well, I'm going to put in 300 calories. I'm going to put in 400 calories in this bottle, and they have a 24-ounce bottle with 400 calories in there. Well, I think they make that mistake of thinking, well, this is going to do both. It's liquid. It's going to hydrate me. But it's like, no. Like, you might get away with it for an hour or two, but when you're 4 or 5 hours into an Ironman, and I mean, like you said, the difference in terms of what that is compared to where your blood is, I mean, it's pretty substantial. And so that's where GI stress, will come into play, right? And also, I mean, what are other symptoms that'll come if you are taking in such a like a hypertonic, like what other things will happen within the body if all you're doing, say over a 4, 5, 8, 10 hour event is just taking in hypertonic, a form of hypertonic. Yeah.
Well, to a degree, they can almost be dehydrating in large
Mm.
quantities, because what happens is they move, fluid has to move from the blood into the gut to then allow for absorption to happen. So you can kind of get a movement of water in the wrong direction. I think the biggest two problems, though, are you get a very sicky stomach, which either results in like being either fully being sick or just getting that kind of reflux and being sick in your mouth, burping up a lot of nasty tasting syrup, or if it really gets bad, you can get diarrhea, because your body just has to clear, because you just get bloated, and sooner or later the body goes enough, and it just has to get rid of the excess. So you just feel horribly uncomfortable, and a lot of us have been there. You just feel like you can put out no power. You're not absorbing the energy, so you can be low on energy, but you're also you just feel like all you can think about is how rotten your stomach feels.
Yeah.
And at that point, it's a long way back from there. Your race is often, relatively speaking, over if it gets to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I made the shift, uh, with, I think it was just like reading your blog, and I think I was getting frustrated with my own racing, where it just was never going well. And later into the ride, I would just get GI symptoms. Like I just kept burping. I kept feeling like I was going to throw up, right? Because like I was just taking in, like too much carbs within a bottle. And I made that shift to literally taking in, I had the sweat. It was actually through the sweat test that I did through you all, and through I would sweat a liter, and I was taking in a thousand milligrams per liter. And it was just in that bottle, every bottle literally was just a precision hydration tab. And I would take in gels, through a bottle. Like, okay, like for my 5 hour ride, I put the gels into the bottle. And it was totally night and day difference with just like the consistent energy that I had across the board. Of like I never had like a low spot. And it really came from like that simple shift of like, just a liquid bottle with the sodium. Yeah, it was pretty big difference. So cool. That's all I have. I mean, for you all, I mean, I want to say thanks for coming on. I thought the information was, like you said, very simple, very precise, but very helpful. I think for me personally, I hope people get the most from the last part we talked about, like the fueling strategies, identifying what is in your bottle. Is there too much in there? How do you go about changing that if you are having these symptoms? But again, I think you all deliver unquestionably, the best stuff on the market. From my personal and coaching side of things, I think you all have the best stuff out there.
No, we really appreciate your kind words, Stephen. It's great, to chat to you after all these years, because I know you've been using this stuff for a good long while. And like I say, I feel like we've got a great solution for a lot of endurance athletes, primarily actually in the hopefully the knowledge of how to organize your fueling and hydration plan, and then secondly, hopefully with the simple products and the way that they work together to be able to do it. So to have your endorsement is really gratifying. So no, thanks
Yeah.
for the opportunity to chat today.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, thanks again, and yeah, have a good day.
Thanks, Steve.